Now, the question is, who needs this and why is this being said? What is the reason why you are having this kind of a binding constraint in terms of the ability of the state to borrow? The reason you have this is because of the fact that this has become a demand of foreign capital, particularly foreign finance capital, wherever it's been provided space in terms of investing in either equity or debt markets, and where over a period of time you've sort of inherited or built up a legacy sum of capital which is resting in your markets, in your equity markets, in your stock exchanges, in your debt markets, etc. Now, why do these foreign financiers not like the government borrowing, not like a fiscal deficit? Well, there could be a number of reasons. One, of course, the reason they don't like it is if governments go and borrow in substantial measure in the open market, and they then find that the interest burden on the budget is going up, they can intervene in the market to try and bring interest rates down so that the interest burden that they have to incur is actually brought down. Now, that amounts to actually having a proactive player influencing the interest rate, which finance doesn't like, because finance places its bets on differences in rates of return in different markets, in, let's say, equity markets, debt markets, etc. And therefore, if you have a non-profit making player intervening in the market and perhaps also trying to fix the interest rate at certain levels, it would be something which would upset the operation of finance capital, which uses its power to be able to make large profits in terms of capital gains. The second reason why this becomes a problem is because of the fact that there is a belief that if the government borrows and spends, independent of the context in which it's borrowing and spending, you would end up with inflation. And inflation is something which is anathema to finance. The reason is that when inflation occurs, the value of financial assets goes down in real terms, because you don't simultaneously, when the prices of goods go up, the value of financial assets go down. So because you fear that these deficits will create inflation, finance capital does not like the government to have a large fiscal deficit and go and borrow in the market. Finally, finance capital moves into countries essentially because of the fact that it looks at possibilities to acquire resources which it can then resell or restructure and resell in order to make large capital gains. So therefore, it likes governments which actually are environments where governments make it easier for foreign investors to operate, where governments are willing to go in for liberalization and are dependent on the role of foreign finance. But they don't like governments which are actually proactive, which say that, listen, I'm going to borrow and spend. I hope that the economy will therefore grow and I'll get more revenues. If I don't get enough revenues, I will tax and I will actually pay back my debt. You don't like proactive governments like that. You want to actually delegitimize the state and legitimize the market in order to be able to play the game of making large capital gains either through acquisition and sale or through acquisition, restructuring and sale. So therefore, the first thing is, nationalism aside, if the state is stuck with an idea that the binding constraint it faces should be the fiscal deficit, and it's constantly reducing it. It used to be, well, close to 5 or more. It's come down. Now it was 3.9% in the fiscal year which is just ending, and it's going to be 3.5% next year. The idea is to get to 3% at some point of time, maybe in the next 3 to 4 years. Now, why 3%? Why not 4%? Why not 2%? Why not 5%? There is no clear logic which actually says that, why am I fixing it there? Possibly it's being fixed there because the Europeans fixed it there as far as their own treaty was concerned. But anyway, there is this target of 3%. Now, fine, if you set this as the binding constraint, then if you want to spend in order to either push growth or you want to spend in order to improve welfare, something else must adjust, because you really cannot borrow beyond a point. So you must be able to, if you want to increase spending, you must be able to mobilize resources in some other manner. So therefore you'd say that, okay, so obviously this is a state which is actually trying to raise more resources through taxation, because it obviously says that, listen, I don't want to borrow. So if you don't want to borrow, and if you want to be a proactive state which is supposed to do what a state is supposed to do, like for now, we know that despite what the GDP figures say, everybody knows that both industry and agriculture are growing very slowly. So you would like the state to actually invest in order to prime the system. Even private capital wants the state to invest in order to prime the system. And there is a debate going on where, in fact, the finance minister said in his speech that I was under much pressure to move away from the path I'm sticking to of consolidating the fisc or reducing the fiscal deficit over a period of time, because there were a number of my advisors who actually were telling me that I should spend more because the economy is in a sluggish phase. So you'd think that what the state would do would then, given whatever objective it has in terms of growth and welfare promotion, it would actually go in for larger taxation, since it has set itself and tied its hands about the amount to which it can go into the market and borrow. Now, does the state do that? No, because the transition which you have under a neoliberal era, which intensifies when you have entities which actually are not seeing foreign capital as being a problem, independent of whether they are nationalist or not, that their conviction is that the way in which growth should occur is by actually trying to incentivize the private sector. If you tax the private sector too much, they won't save enough, they won't invest enough, which means you wouldn't have enough growth. So your role is to incentivize the private sector. But this is not to say that the state disappears. The state is there. It's just that the state has transformed itself from being a proactive entity trying to promote growth to being one which is a proactive entity trying to facilitate the private sector, particularly big capital and finance. So if that is the agenda, obviously you can't go in for any significant taxation. In fact, the finance minister had declared in the last budget that, listen, I'm going to reduce the corporate taxation rate from 30 to 25% over the next few years. He's done a little bit of it this time for some parts of the corporate sector. And therefore, you really cannot, through direct taxation of the corporates, raise much resources. You don't want, in a period when growth is sluggish, to hit the middle class too much. In any case, that's unpopular. So you cannot get too much from income taxes. So what do you have? You can either have indirect taxes, or you can have non-tax revenue, because you can't go and borrow. Of course, finally, you can go and sell some assets in order to get yourself resources, because that doesn't create debt. Now, if we look at this budget, this budget in terms of what has happened in the year which is just ending, and what they expect to happen in the year which is going to come, there are two or three things which explain how, or sort of indicate how, a government which has tied its hands because of its need to appease foreign capital has been able to maneuver for a year or two. And we need to understand that, because that would tell us whether this kind of ability to maneuver can persist over a period of time. Now, one way in which the maneuver took place was that, because it was lucky, one of the things which happened when the NDA government came to power is that was the period in which global oil prices were collapsing. I mean, oil prices were in the range of close to $100 or above $100 a barrel. They are now down to $30 a barrel. That's a huge decline. But if you go out and try and buy yourself some petroleum product, you wouldn't find that kind of a decline, the proportionate decline where if something was 10 rupees, you're now going to get it for 3 rupees. That you don't see that kind of decline. The reason you don't see that kind of decline is that on a calibrated basis, the government decided that as these prices come down, what they would do is that they would increase the duties that they impose on it. So they have three different kinds of duties imposed on motor spirit and diesel. And if you look at the year 2014-15, I mean, I've got the figures in my pocket, but there was a huge increase, a huge, massive increase in just duties imposed on petroleum and petroleum products, which brought in a large amount of revenue, which the government then they decided to use to a certain extent to undertake its expenditures. The second way in which they tried to mobilize resources was, of course, to go in for disinvestment. So, with a sense of bravado, the finance minister in the last budget said, I'm going to mobilize something like 69,500 crores by selling either equity in the market, which is disinvestment, or by strategically selling full public sector corporations and handing over management control to the private sector. Well, the markets are not so accommodative. It's not so easy to just go and dump assets into the market. So what you actually have is that by the end of the year, as opposed to something like 70,000 crores, they've been able to mobilize by selling their assets only something like 25,000 crores. So therefore, while this gives them some revenue, the kind of ambition which was there in the budget in terms of being able to get non-debt receipts of these kind obviously didn't materialize. So that what you have then is that if you look at what happened, to the extent that you stuck to that fiscal deficit to GDP ratio of 3.9%, the target that you'd set yourself, obviously expenditures couldn't go up too much. Okay, so if expenditures couldn't go up too much, obviously the kind of projections you had for expenditure didn't go where it should. And we saw the effects. We saw the effects in terms of what happened in terms of allocations for the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program. We saw what it did for allocations for food security, even though we now have a food security bill, and so on and so forth. So that you basically saw a slash in health, education, employment programs, etc., the social sector expenditures, and you saw a certain cut which occurred in terms of capital expenditures. For example, the railways got 12,000 crores less than they were promised at the beginning of last year. Now, the difficulty is, supposing you get a huge chunk of money because of the fact that you got a windfall gain from an oil price collapse. Now, oil prices can't collapse to zero. So we are more or less at the end in terms of how much you could mobilize out of imposing taxes in order to sort of skim off this surplus or ostensible surplus instead of transferring it to the consumer. The difficulty is oil prices can rise. So if oil prices can rise, then you might have inflation, so you might have to think of reducing these duties. But the least is, you cannot expect between this year which is coming to an end and the year which is going to happen to be able to get another large bonanza because of the fact that oil prices are low. You've taken what you could get. It's a once for all shot. You put it into your kitty. It's there, but you now cannot increase it beyond a certain point. Okay. The second thing is, obviously, if you say that, listen, every year I set myself a target to mobilize resources in terms of being able to, in terms of selling assets in the public sector, and I don't realize 1,000 crores, you get 25,000 crores, then obviously you must reduce your ambition. So what the finance minister has been forced to do is to say, I'm not going to give up on disinvestment. Of course, now the department which is going to be responsible for it is not called a department for disinvestment. It's called a department for investment and public sector management. That's the way it has been renamed in this budget. So you invest by handing over your assets to the private sector in return for cash. But you basically have, therefore, if you look at the figure, yes, they've decided that they'll get something like 55,000, 56,000 crores. So you're going to get less from there. So then the question arises, are you going to relax your binding constraint? Because you need to spend in order to accelerate growth. And also you need to spend because obviously there is a realization now that with elections coming, this kind of hype about, make in India and, startup India and all of these different kinds of Indias, that this is not working. You really got to do something else. So you see this amazing transformation. Suddenly they've discovered the poor, the vulnerable, the peasantry, farmers and so on and so forth. So that the tune in this budget is completely different. Now, you should expect that if you're actually serious and political and you want to do this kind of thing, even if it's a bit late, then you must actually put your money where your mouth is. So therefore, what are you going to do? You've got to relax your binding constraint. You shouldn't be operating with a fiscal deficit which limits your ability to be able to borrow, or you should decide to go in for significantly larger taxation. Okay. Now, if we look at it, there is, to a certain extent, a continuation as far as corporate taxation is concerned and income tax is concerned, the unwillingness to tax. But there are areas from which you're actually observing, even though you cannot get the same bonanza out of oil, we see that there are areas in which, besides the 56,000 crores that you have, that this government is hoping that it can get money. The big area where there's going to be something like 30 to 40,000 crores extra they're expecting to mobilize is through the sale of spectrum. We know the scams which are associated with spectrum scale. We know, of course, we now have an auction procedure. But basically the idea is we're going to get something like almost 50,000 crores extra just by selling and auctioning spectrum in the next round which is coming. And if you've read about it, you know that the TRAI has set prices extremely high. So it's unclear whether people would be competitive if they buy spectrum at that price. But on the other hand, the government wants this money, and that seems to get reflected in the budget. Now, which means that you're now adding on another kind of sale of assets, because spectrum is, after all, an asset. It's a public good which is available, but which you can exclude. So it's an asset which you're going to sell. And in addition to that, what has really happened is that there is been through a really motley set of cesses, okay, different kinds of cesses which have been imposed, cess here, cess there, and so on and so forth. You're really creating this sort of morass of, this is supposed to be a government which is trying to rationalize the tax structure, but you're actually now making it extremely irrational because you're trying to pick up little bits from different areas by imposing these cesses. The difficulty with the cess is, of course, is that everybody pays it, because anybody who's buying a service, for example, now will have to pay the cess on service, which has been, the tax has been raised from 12% to 15%. So you actually have, therefore, an effort not to directly absorb the surplus, but to impose taxes very often on people who are not even part of the tax net as of now, because they don't earn the incomes in order to actually enter the taxation block. Well, long years back, we haven't had a study of that kind. In 1973-74, Raja Chelaya, no means a radical, did a study on indirect taxation in India and found that, a very large part of indirect taxation came from households who earned less than 500 rupees per capita per month, which means if you have a family of 5, they were earning at that point of time, 1973-74 prices, 2,500, and they were nowhere near the tax bracket. But they accounted for a dominant share of indirect taxes which were being paid. So therefore, what you have is a certain amount of resort to indirect taxation, which is inflationary in as much as it's passed on to those who buy the good or the service, and to try and dig deeper into the assets that you have and try and sell these assets in order to be able to get the resources that you need. Now fine, okay, we might not agree with it, we might not think that's positive, but is that proving to be a successful strategy? Well, if you look at what success would mean, then, is that to cover the huge infrastructure investments that they want to make, something like 50-60,000 crores extra on roads and similar amounts of money on railways and so on and so forth, because those are considered the way to stimulate growth. And because now they say that they're going to give huge amounts of money to farmers and the poor and give all sorts of insurance schemes, etc., you'd expect that there would be some increase in expenditure which is being sustained as a result of mobilizing resources through these means. Now, if you look at it, in 2015-16, that's the year which is coming to an end, about 13.2% was the total expenditure of the central government relative to GDP. About 13% of GDP was being spent in a year by the central government. If you look at 2016-17, based on the budget estimates, it's 13.1%, very, very marginally lower, is going to be spent in 2016-17. So obviously, in terms of the fiscal stance, you are stuck because of the fact that you want to keep that deficit target in order to appease finance and big capital. You are stuck with this mode in which you basically are freezing your expenditures. Now, if you freeze your expenditures and claim that you're going to do all sorts of things which are major, then obviously you must be reallocating your spending. You must be taking money out of somewhere and putting it into the areas which are now prioritizing. If you're prioritizing infrastructure, if you're prioritizing the farmers, you'll have to actually take money from somewhere and put it here, because of the fact that the overall expenditure is not expected to rise, despite all of this playing around with new resources from asset sales, playing around with all sorts of indirect taxes of one kind or another, and they constitute a significant amount in terms of additional revenues due to indirect taxes. And finally, of course, what you do is you inflate. It's very clear if you look at what the budget estimates for tax revenue collection were for this year and what the revised estimates which we have now, we are way short of what was expected. That's going to happen next year as well. So you will have to cut some expenditures later in order to make sure that you get your 3.5% if you're going to stick with that figure. So therefore, what you have then is the question, listen, at least in terms of priorities, does this hype, does this rhetoric actually get reflected in the budget figures? And let's take, for example, he said that I am allocating 35,000, I think 895 crores for the farmers. Okay, it's one sentence, that's it. So you say, 35,895, we don't mug up budget documents, so we want to know, how much were you spending last year? So you go to what you were spending last year and you find, this is a big increase. There's something like 15,000, whatever, let's say 300 or something crores which are spent last year, and now you're going to have 35,800 crores. And then you start looking at the figures, which are now, not put next to each other. There's one set of figures put on top and the rest of them below, and you're wondering, why are previous figures below and this one on top? And you realize that there is something called interest subvention. There is a interest subsidy given for short-term crop loans to farmers, which earlier used to be under the finance ministry, because that's a subvention from finance. Now they've taken it and moved it into agriculture, cooperation and rural development, and therefore you have this 15,000 crores, but the figure last year was 13,000 crores. So you really raised that by 2,000 crores, because obviously there's growth occurring, so you have to raise it. So you take out from 35,000 crores, you take out this 15,000 crores, and you're really talking about 20,000 crores, and we don't even know whether that's going to be realized. So this hype that we're going to do all this for farmers is just that. It really doesn't reflect. Similarly, and I won't give you too many examples. Similarly, they say that this is going to be, the coming year is going to be the year when it's going to be the highest spend for the Rural Employment Guarantee Program. What was going to be the highest spend? 38,500 crores. So you say, okay, let's go back and see what was spent in the year which gone by, and you find that something like 36,000 crores or 35,000 crores was spent. There's something like 6,000 crores in arrears which have still to be paid to those who have already undertaken work. And the figure which you have in the revised estimates doesn't take into account fully the works which will be conducted in the month of March, because this financial year goes on till April. So actually, possibly what you have is, after taking inflation into account, let's say inflation is, maybe they say it's going to be in the range of about 4 to 5%. Okay, let's accept that. If it's going to be 4 to 5%, then you're in essence saying that what is being allocated is even less than what was allocated in the previous year, let alone in the peak year 2009-10, which was the best year for the NREGA scheme. So what you have is a combination of deception and sleight of hand, which is then combined with optimistic projections of revenues, and this hope that you can actually sell off these assets to get yourself money, which underlies this so-called new strategy to be able to meet the goal which the Prime Minister set and which the Finance Minister has parroted, that by 2022 we want to double the income of all farmers in this country. So, it's going to be good days ahead for all of us. Now, the last point I'd like to make is that, does this mean that there is no strategy out here? Whether going to be successful or not is a different thing. But is there some method in this madness, to the extent that it's possible to generate some growth? Obviously, there must be. Yeah, it's true that the finance minister is a lawyer. He might know some things about corporates because he works for corporates. But he's not much of an economist. But still, he has advisors. They're pretty smart, and so on and so forth. So what could be the thinking? And it seems obvious. Well, there are a lot of concessions in the text, but there's an appendix 1 to the budget speech, which basically says that a whole set of new areas are going to be opened up, including allowing central public sector enterprises to sell to foreign portfolio investors, not up to 26% as they were allowed to do of their equity, but up to 49% of their equity they are allowed to sell to the foreign portfolio investors. Why do foreign portfolio investors buy it? Not because they love India's public sector. They buy it because they hope that somebody will come tomorrow, the day after, when it may be, and actually offer them a higher price so that they can make a capital gain. So even though they are not direct investors, they're looking for the direct investor to come in future, and when they want to exit, you'll be under pressure to change the rules, not merely for foreign portfolio investors, but for regular investors who want to take over a part of the public sector. So the idea is straightforward, that listen, we've somehow, besides traveling to every possible country in the world, we must somehow try and attract capital to come into this country and make in India. Now, where are they going to sell? It's going to be difficult to sell too much in India because you're not promoting growth in India. And this is not the best time in the world for you to go and try to sell in Europe or even the United States. We know what the situation is as far as this country is concerned. Thank you.